Hello and welcome everyone to day one of the 2024 US Expats Financial Conference, brought to you by AmericanExpatDirectory.com and sponsored by Expat Focus, the web's favorite destination for anyone moving or living abroad. We have a fantastic schedule for you consisting of 9 sessions over 3 days, covering multiple aspects of financial information for Americans living abroad, with perspectives from some of the world's foremost experts in their fields. Today is the first day of the conference, and for this, our third session of the day, I'm delighted to be joined by Rebecca Lammers, Chair of Democrats Abroad Taxation Task Force and international member of the Taxpayer Advocacy Panel. We'll be talking about demystifying voting and taxes for US expats. Thank you very much for joining us, Rebecca, and how are you today?
I'm good. Yeah, looking forward to getting into the topic. Yeah,
Cool.
should I go ahead and get started?
I'm just before you do, please bear in mind our audience that the information is general educational purposes only. You should always seek your own personalized financial advice. Rebecca will be answering your questions at the end, so please add them in the Q&A, pop up at the foot of your screen throughout, and we'll try to answer them all at the end, time permitting. So without further ado, over to you, Rebecca.
Great, thank you. I'm just going to go ahead and share my screen here, and I'll look at answering questions towards the end. I'm not going to look at the chat box while I'm presenting, just to let you guys know. But yeah, good afternoon, good evening, good morning, wherever you are in the world. It's really nice to be here with you. I was just going to mention up front that if you would like to get a copy of the slides, I think everybody's going to get a copy of the recording sent, but if you want a copy of the slides and the links, you can drop us an email and we can send you a copy of the slides and the links after the webinar. Yeah, I'm sorry, I can't multitask, so I'm going to be presenting and I'll mention some links to things, but you can email to get the link for those things. And just a little disclaimer up front that I am not an accountant. So I'm not regulated to give advice, and this webinar is basically just for informational purposes only. So a little bit about me, as Hugo mentioned, I'm the chair of the Democrats Abroad Taxation Task Force. So I'm one of many volunteers for Democrats Abroad, which is a volunteer-led organization leading on our tax advocacy work, which I'll talk a lot more about later. I am also the international member of the Taxpayer Advocacy Panel, which is a federal advisory committee of the IRS. I'll talk more about that as well later too. But I just wanted to let you guys know that I'm coming from a position of I got involved with this work because I moved abroad, and I many years later down the line realized that I had been filing incorrectly and called a bunch of accountants to try to figure out how to do it and could not get a straightforward answer. And I found the whole system incredibly frustrating and difficult to navigate. And so I decided to get involved in tax advocacy in order to fix the tax problems for Americans abroad. And that is where we are at this point in time. So I wanted to start out with a kind of icebreaker. So I think we have like a quiz that could pop up on your screen here. The first question is, it's a really simple yes or no question. If you vote in federal elections only, so that means like if you vote in for president, House, and Senate, are you liable for state tax? And I can't.
Rebecca, technical issue on my side, and I can't seem to launch the poll. So maybe, folks, maybe you can drop your answers into the chat.
Okay,
Just get a gauge of that.
I'll open up the chat. So type yes or no if you think that if you vote in federal elections, does that mean that you will therefore be liable for state tax? So I'm seeing a mix. I'm seeing yes, I'm seeing no, I'm seeing some people say maybe, it depends. I'll give it another few seconds here. Yes, no, yes, no, maybe. I don't know. That's okay. We're gonna find out here in a second. Okay, so the answer is no. if you vote in federal elections, you are not liable for state tax. And I'll talk a little bit more about the difference between federal and state elections here in a second. But next question. I've never lived in the US, but I'm a US citizen. Can I vote in US elections? And you can type into the chat box yes or no. Yes, I'm seeing yeses. Yes, 100%. Lots of yeses. It depends. Lots of more it depends is. Okay, I'm gonna go ahead and say yes, of course, you can vote in US elections. If you are a US citizen, you are allowed to vote in US elections. That's how it works. And I'll talk a little bit more about the kind of nuances here, but on a high, really high level here, there are different types of US taxes. There's the federal tax, so that basically means the national tax, the tax for the country, where everybody's liable for federal taxes. And then you also have state taxes. So if you own a home in a particular state, more often than not, you have to pay state taxes and also local taxes for your city or township or county or what have you. So there's lots of different types of taxes. Um, just kind of on a really high level, I get the impression a lot of people are really switched on attending this webinar, but just to clarify, all Americans must file a US tax return with the IRS for federal taxes. So the IRS covers federal taxes. That's the country level of taxes. And this liability, so just to clarify again, this liability of needing to file a US tax return doesn't always necessarily mean that you owe US taxes. And one of the biggest frustrations that I hear from people is that they feel it's too complicated to file a tax return, so they have to pay an accountant to do it for them in order to prove that they've already paid tax in the country that they live in and prove that they are therefore don't owe any US tax. And so if you look at the IRS statistics, you'll see that 60% of filings from abroad don't actually owe any US tax. And it's actually the higher earner income bracket where people end up getting double taxed. The people who are low and middle income tend not to owe anything. So this is applicable to you if you are a US citizen. And it doesn't matter if you're a dual citizen, your other citizenship doesn't matter. It doesn't matter if you have if you're a tri-citizen, or how you identify. Even if you're an accidental American, you are a US citizen and therefore you are liable for US taxes. And this still applies even if you don't have a US passport. I get people asking, oh, my passport expired. Am I still a US citizen? Yes, you are still a US citizen, even if your US passport has expired, even if you've never received or gotten a US passport, even if you don't have a US Social Security number, and even if you were born abroad uh, and not born in the US. And to an American parent, and your birth was not registered with the nearest American embassy. And even if you choose not to identify as an American, which I also hear sometimes, but this is the reality of the situation, is that all Americans must file a US tax return with the IRS for federal taxes if you meet the filing thresholds. So filing thresholds are determined based on your filing status. I'm very happy to include a link in follow-up material where you can go and find out if you need to file, but it tends to be around $15,000 at the moment or so, depending on your filing status. But so I just wanted to clarify federal taxes. That's what we're talking about right now. So when it comes to voting in federal elections, all Americans have the right to vote in US federal elections, regardless of whether you have resided in the US or not. how long you've lived abroad. I know some countries with their expat population, you can vote up to a certain period of time, and then after that time, you no longer are eligible to vote. That is not the case for US citizens. Doesn't matter how long you've lived abroad, you can still vote from abroad, even if you've lived abroad for 100 years, even 50 years, 20 years, whatever the years are, you can still vote. It doesn't matter if your birth was registered at the American Embassy even, or whether you have a US Social Security number, you are still eligible and have the right to vote in US federal elections. And that right is protected under the Uniformed and Overseas Citizens Absentee Voting Act, or UACAVA for short, which protects all Americans' right to vote in federal elections who are living outside of the US. So that, talking about federal voting and taxes here, they have nothing to do with each other, and you can vote. So how to register to vote from abroad? You can request your absentee ballot at votefromabroad.org. It's the one that's recommended by Democrats abroad. And if you ever need any kind of assistance or help, you can always email the voter help desk, which is just voterhelp@votefromabroad.org for assistance. And we have volunteers all over the world staffing the help desk 24/7, especially this year. So if you need any assistance, feel free to reach out. Oh, sorry, I forgot one other thing here. In terms of voting and taxes on the federal level, even if you don't file a tax return, so you're not liable for filing a tax return, you can still vote. There is no requirement to file your taxes in order to vote. And actually, a lot of people have this misconception that if you vote and you haven't filed a tax return, then there's going to be some kind of communication between the IRS and your local state election official. That doesn't happen. Like if you have not filed, and this is very common, a lot of people don't file because they don't know, and it's not their fault. But filing a tax return is not contingent on your right to vote. The IRS does not speak to your local election official in the state where you register to vote. They're actually not allowed to share data or information at all. So it just doesn't happen. They're not connected at all. So hopefully that helps clarify on that. How do you receive your ballot from abroad? Well, there's two different ways. You can either receive it by email, or you can receive it by postal mail. We really recommend that you get it by email because it's faster. All local election officials are required to send out ballots 45 days before an election takes place. That gives you plenty of time to be able to get your ballot returned back. But for you to be able to get it by email and print it out and then mail it back is a lot faster than you waiting on it to be mailed to you. I know a lot of people have in their mind like, oh, I really like getting it in the mail and feeling it and filling out the official ballot. And I think historically, when the post was a lot more reliable, perhaps that would have been okay. But these days, mail isn't always 100% reliable. So we really do, email is a lot more reliable and you get it a lot faster. So we do recommend that you receive your ballot by email to get it faster so that you can then return it faster. And then in terms of the return of your ballot, very few states, but a few do allow you to email return your ballot. So Colorado and Washington states do allow this. But most states require your ballot to be posted back. And so this is, again, the reason why we recommend that you sign up for email ballots is you get it by email, you print it out, you mail it back, and that gives you the best opportunity of making sure that your ballot is received before the deadline, because a lot of these ballots get lost in the mail, and you need time in order to sort that out or send a new one, or It takes a lot of time for it to be processed through international mail anyway. So just that's one of the reasons why email to receive and mail it back if that's what your state requires. And fax, yeah, I know fax. Who uses fax? Well, the US government uses faxing, believe it or not. It is a good backup option if your state allows faxing back. And you're coming up to the deadline. So these are just things to keep in mind for receiving and returning your ballot. In terms of what your ballot looks like, and this is just to kind of break it down, you'll see more often than not different sections on your ballot, and there will be the federal section. It tends to start with federal. So this year is a presidential election year, so you'll be able to choose who you want to vote for president, also for the House of Representatives and the Senate. So a third of the seats are up for re-election in the Senate. So not everybody will necessarily be voting in the Senate this year, but everybody will at the very least have president and House of Representatives on their ballot. And then you might also get state and local elections on your ballot as well. And you do have a right to vote in these elections too, but whether or not these appear on your ballot depends on a box that you tick on your voter registration form, which I'll talk a little bit more about here in a minute. Okay, so getting into state taxes and voting. So now we're switching from federal, which has nothing to do with taxes, to state. So state taxes, this is where it can get a little hairy. So there's a few different questions that you need to ask yourself. The first one is, what box did you tick on your absentee ballot request form when you registered to vote? Number two, does your state have income tax in the first place? Because if your state doesn't have income tax, then there is no state taxes. It's as simple as that. Number three, what is your state's definition of a resident? And then number four, does your state even allow you to vote down ballot? So I'm going to go into these now in more detail. So first one is when you register to vote, and you'll find this after you go through on votefromabroad.org or on the Expat website. When you register to vote, you select what state you vote from, and you'll always select the last address. You'll basically register to vote based on the last address where you lived in the United States. It doesn't matter if you don't live there anymore. Some people will register to vote at their brother or their sister's house because it's just easier to get mail. You know, it depends, but basically you select where you last lived, and that's where you register to vote from. And you have these options in terms of requesting your absentee ballot to demonstrate that you're eligible to vote by absentee ballot overseas. So the two that most people select are I am a US citizen living outside the country and my return is uncertain, or the one above that where it says I'm a US citizen living outside the country and I intend to return. So this is where depending on the state that you last lived in, if you tick I intend to return, then some states will send you the state and local elections or just some of the state elections on your ballot. If you tick my return is uncertain, some states will not send you the state and local elections because going back to the UOCAVA law, your right is protected for federal elections, but it's down to the state to determine whether or not you're allowed to vote in state elections. So that's the difference. And it really does depend on the state. You really do need to understand what the difference is, depending on the state that you live in. I have a few of the top ones that I'm going to go into a little bit more detail about in a bit. But for example, I vote in Ohio. In Ohio, it doesn't matter what box you tick, you will always receive the full ballot with all of the elections on it. And again, it's up to you whether you want to vote all of the elections, but personally, I always do. So Yeah, it really does depend on what your state allows and which box you tick on this form. Okay, so the other part was whether or not your state has income tax. Well, it's really pretty easy for the ones listed on the screen right now. They don't have any income tax. So there is no state taxes and there's nothing for you to worry about. Um, and it's as simple as that. So it doesn't matter what which oh no, sorry. I'll go into a little bit more detail about which box to tick for these states here in a bit. But again, no state taxes for these states, so you don't need to worry about that. Okay, so the main thing about whether or not you are liable for state tax depends on whether you are deemed a state resident. So every state has a different definition of residency. And you'll basically need to figure out if you're still considered a resident. And yes, again, you can still be deemed a state resident and therefore liable for state tax, even if you've lived a very long time outside of the country / outside of that state. So ways to be able to look up the definition is on the state's website. You can contact a state tax accountant. I've talked to a few people who have spoken to expat accountants. They don't always necessarily know. There are actually accountants that specialize in specific state taxes. So ideally, you would want to speak to an expert of tax for that particular state, if you do want to consult an accountant on that. Or you can actually just call the local state's tax administrator and they will walk you through it, because establishing state residency is different. The definition of a resident is different in every state. So it it can be difficult. Some states are more difficult to prove that you are no longer a state resident and therefore no longer liable for state tax than others. So for example, California and Virginia are known as sticky states. In particular, those states make it extremely difficult in order to prove that you are no longer a state resident and therefore liable for filing and owing state tax. Um, and the other thing to keep in mind is that not all states will use voting to establish residency. So a state could use voting as a piece of criteria, but they can't, and this is a really key thing I really want to emphasize here, they cannot use it as the sole piece of criteria to establish residency in that state. Like we already covered, your right to vote in federal elections is protected by federal law. So if you don't have any other connections to that state, like you don't have a state driving license or a library card, you don't own property there, you don't have a bank account there, you know, you need to, again, you need to look at the state's definition of a resident to see what criteria they use to establish it. But they cannot use voting as the sole piece of criteria to establish if you are a state resident and therefore liable for state tax. And this is the official guidance that's provided by the Federal Voter Assistance Program. I'll just read it out here. It says, voting in an election for federal offices may not be used as the sole basis to determine residency for the purpose of imposing state and local taxes. If you claim a particular state as your residence and have other ties to that state in addition to voting, you may be liable for state and local taxation, depending on that particular state law. If you are unsure of your voting residence, or if you are concerned about the state tax implications of claiming a specific voting residence, you should consult legal counsel. So I don't think you actually need to consult legal counsel unless you have a particularly difficult, complicated situation. But like I went over on the other slide, we'll just go back. You can look up your state's definition of resident on their website, contact a state tax accountant, or even call the state tax administrator, explain your situation, and they will explain to you whether you are a state resident or not. Okay. So, um, case study here. So I'm going to go from one extreme to the other here. So we're going to start with the easy one. No state tax states. So I talked about whether you tick the I intend to return or return is uncertain box. So this is where it can get a little confusing, but I'm gonna talk through some examples here. So for example, in Florida, which a lot of people here, I'm assuming probably vote in Florida, doesn't matter what box you tick, you will get all of the elections sent to you on your ballot when you register to vote. Doesn't matter if you tick I intend to return or return is not certain. Doesn't matter. You'll get all the elections on your ballot. And there's no state tax, so there's nothing to worry about. You guys are totally in the clear. No problemo. Um, but okay, let's look at Texas, for example. So with Texas, if you click the return not certain box, then you're not going to get state elections on your ballot. And you would have to take the I intend to return. Now, I mean, whether you intend to return or not is there's no like legal definition around this. It literally is basically, well, do you think you might move? It doesn't even mean that you're going to move back to that state. Like you could potentially in the future, even if there's like a 1% chance you might return to the United States, you could tick the I intend to return box. It really is a personal choice at this point, which box you tick. But with Texas, I'll give you an example. I was talking to a woman who was a Texas voter in 2022, and that was the year that Beto O'Rourke was running for governor. And that's a state. He was running for Texas governor, right? So she was telling me, "Oh, it's a real shame because I don't plan on going back to Texas, and but I really wanted to vote for him." And I was like, "Well, there's no state tax in Texas, and like, you don't have to tick the box because I mean, is there like 1% chance you might move back to the States?" And she was like, "Yeah, maybe. I mean, I don't know." And I was like, "Well, if you send your ballot and tick I intend to return, you'll get the full ballot and you'll be able to vote for Beto O'Rourke." And she was like, "Oh, right. Okay, cool." And so she did. So like this is where like you need to look at your personal situation and figure out like how you want to do it so that you can vote in those additional races that are really exciting. There are really exciting governor races and one of the things that we in Democrats Abroad talk about all the time is that the votes from abroad make a huge difference because elections are so close now. It was the votes from abroad in Georgia and Arizona, and it was only like thousands of votes that made the difference to help Biden win in 2020, and it will be the votes from abroad that will help us win this year. So this is why like looking at maximizing your vote and voting in those additional elections is so important to like make sure you're ticking the right boxes so that you get the ballot with all of the elections that you can vote in and then vote in those elections. So okay, so that's the one end. The other end, California. Oh man. So I've cited the reference to the guidelines for determining resident status in California. These are factors to consider, but it's not like it's explicit because it says in their guidance like it might include some other things. So they do list the state where you're registered to vote. They do talk about bank accounts. They talk about where your medical professionals are located. I mean, these guys make it really hard. California makes it really hard to prove that you are no longer a California state resident. So, um, when it comes to voting in California, if you are really, really concerned about them coming after you for state tax, and you want to really prove that you are no longer a California state resident, then one of the things that you can do is tick the box that says, I do not intend to return, and then you will only get the federal elections but you will not be able to vote in the state elections. And in general, what you should do is call California, because they really are on an individual, like, this is such detailed criteria to go through. And it is very difficult to prove that you are no longer California state residents. So it is something for you that you will need to look into based on your personal circumstances. If you own property in California in particular, from what I've heard, it's very, very difficult to prove, even if you're renting it out, that you are no longer a California resident. So when you file your federal return, you also have to file a California state return. And California is a real stickler. They don't even have foreign tax credits. They don't let you use the foreign earned income exclusion. Um, yeah, California is hard. So yes, that is kind of it. What I'm going to do now is I'm going to invite you guys to submit your questions, but I'm going to talk a little bit about Democrats Abroad and some of the work that we do, and then we'll go to the Q&A, if that sounds okay. So basically, Democrats Abroad, in the Taxation Task Force, we're a group of volunteers from all over the world that are working together in order to change the tax code to make it better for Americans abroad. Some of the things that we advocate for are a switch to residency-based taxation, which would mean that you would only pay and file tax in the country that you live in, rather than also having to be liable for US tax and having to file a tax return to prove that you owe nothing, and potentially being subject to double taxation. So we want to change that, make it just residency-based taxation, eliminate the FATCA reporting for foreign accounts of Americans abroad, and exempting American business owners abroad from the GILTI and transition taxes. You can read more about our work on our website, which is just democratsabroad.org/taxation. What does Democrats Abroad do for the American abroad community? Well, basically, we wrote a report in 2022 where we surveyed just under 7,000 Americans abroad on the tax and financial access issues that they experience, as well as helping host tax and financial education events all over the world. We also submit statements for the record for congressional hearings. We do candidate outreach and education, as well as visit Washington, D.C. to talk with legislators face to face. I mentioned the report. I would really highly recommend reading our report. A lot of people I've heard from who have said that they've read it, they felt a lot less alone in a lot of the difficulties that Americans abroad face with the tax and financial access issues. More often than not, people feel very alone. They don't know where to go or what resources are available. And so this report really helps clarify all of the systemic issues that we're experiencing. I was just also going to mention that we're in the process of running our own tax webinar series. So we have one coming up tomorrow on retirement and taxes. And those of you that are here, I would really recommend our the finale webinar, which I'm hosting on February 28th, on how to pass residency-based taxation, because we need your help to make it happen. So yes, those are coming up. And we also have a number of country-specific tax webinars coming up too. So if you see your country of residence on this list, please join us for a local cross-border webinar where we can get into the more detailed conversation about specific products and quirks of your country and the US tax code. I'm also going to mention a little bit about my work with the Taxpayer Advocacy Panel. So basically, the panel is a federal advisory committee that is run under the Department of Treasury, and it includes representatives from all 50 states, DC, Puerto Rico, and one international member living abroad. And I am your international member. The IRS has made a commitment to listen to ideas from the Taxpayer Advocacy Panel. So basically, we submit suggestions for improvements on communication and customer service. So if you ever have an idea of a systemic issue that you think the IRS should improve, you can email me on my TAP email address. And you can also just go to the website improveirs.org and submit your comment. And it will, all comments are reviewed and considered. The other thing I was going to mention, because I'm just conscious of time, but in my work under the Taxpayer Advocacy Panel, I've built relationships with the Taxpayer Advocate Service, and basically we'll be conducting some what are called online problem solving days in order to assist taxpayers. So if you're experiencing a financial harm or have a financial difficulty because of a tax problem, or if you have an ongoing issue that you haven't been able to resolve with the IRS, I know a lot of people still have outstanding payments from the COVID payments, or you believe the IRS system or procedure isn't working for you. It is free for these problem solving days. They're just a Zoom drop-in. You do have to sign up though, and then you're assigned an appointment during a 3-hour window on March 11th as well as March 22nd. One is for one side of the world, the other one is a time that's friendly for the other side of the world. And we have more dates that are coming up in May and September, but it's totally free. You can just show up. You can just ask, oh, I'm having problem filling in line 32 on form, whatever, like what should I do? And there will be a taxpayer advocate who will be available to help answer your question for free. So that's a new service that's available for Americans abroad. So sadly, this is my last year on the Taxpayer Advocacy Panel, and we're currently in the process of recruiting for a new member that would start in 2025. The applications are now open, and the deadline for applications is March 15th. I am going to be hosting some information sessions in order to encourage international taxpayers in order to apply. So if you're interested, you can join me on March 3rd and March 6th for those sessions. And I know a lot of people are like, oh, it's not for me. I never in my wildest dreams ever thought I would get it, to be honest. And and here I am. And it's a really great opportunity. They need more people like you, whoever you are on this webinar. They need more people. They have a lot of people who are accountants, who are on the Taxpayer Advocacy Panel. It is for any taxpayer who cares about improving the system. And so think about it. Please do. I hope you apply. And lastly, when it comes to voting, we're hosting voting assistance Zooms on a regular basis through this very important election cycle. And again, you can sign up for those by going to bit.ly/Zoom the vote, as well as email us if you need any assistance. And you can also follow us on social media on whatever your preferred platform is. Lastly, I'm going to mention that Democrats Abroad also hosts our own presidential primary. And it is going to be on Super Tuesday in March, but you can actually vote by email, fax. Yeah, I know, government, fax, whatever, post or in person at a voting center near you, starting on February 13th, which is just in about a week, through to March 12th. And the only criteria is that you need to be residing abroad and be a US citizen, be a member of Democrats Abroad, which is totally free. You can just go to the Democrats Abroad website and sign up for an account, and then you're a member and you're good to go. You do need to be 18 by the November election, and you do need to make sure that you have not voted or plan to vote in any other state presidential primary. So for example, I just got my Ohio ballot. For the primary, I left it blank for president because I plan on voting in the Democrats Abroad presidential primary, and I voted in all of the other primary races on mine. So you just need to make sure that you can't double dip, basically. It's not allowed. But you can do same day registration in person or online in order to vote in the Democrats Abroad primary. And lastly, some actions that you can take. I would really recommend that you sign up for the Taxation Task Force mailing list to stay up to date on events, as well as our actions that we're taking to improve the tax system for Americans abroad. Yeah, great. I think we got time to go to the Q&A now. So I'll just leave this up. So you have my email address that you can contact me on. Okay, so So I
Yeah,
think,
thank you very much, Rebecca. A fantastic presentation, loads of really useful info there. So what I'll do is I'll read out some of these questions for you.
yeah,
Um,
that would be great. There's a lot.
There are lots
I'm,
come in. I was
yeah.
just going to say to the audience, make sure you put any questions in the Q&A, not the chat, and then we kind of got them all in one place. So let's start with this. If my state sends me the state elections, but I do not return the ballot, does that mean I have voted?
So I mean, I've voted in the state elections.
Yeah.
No, actually, there are states where even if you take the I do not intend to return, and they're supposed to only send you federal elections. Sometimes they're lazy and they just send you the whole thing anyway. So, no, it doesn't.
Yeah.
It you get your ballot and you vote for whatever races that you want to vote for on your ballot. Um,
Right. Okay.
yeah.
Um, So somebody says also, in terms of Americans required to file federal taxes and also voting on a federal level, you really considered an American if you were born abroad to at least one American parent. They decided not to give you citizenship at birth by declaring at the consulate. Does that mean all people born outside the US to an American expat parent are automatically US citizens? Isn't there a choice for the parents?
I'm these are all out of order, so I was trying to read along to the question. So is that the third one down?
I'm
Is
just
that the
going to
one?
jump around and pick some out for you. But yeah, no, it's just the idea that I think is it not right that anyone born to an American parent outside the US is automatically a US citizen? It's not sort of parental choice.
It depends on the law. So, the for example, the parent has to have lived in the US for at least 14 years, in order to then pass on citizenship to the child. That said, there is a kind of additional thing that you can apply for, where you can get US citizenship via your grandparent. Um, so what you need to do is you need to go onto the US State Department's website where they go through in detail about the how US citizenship is passed on and whether your child is has received citizenship by birth, or if they're eligible to receive um, US citizenship by applying for it. So it depends, but for the most part, for most Americans who are born abroad, sorry, for most, if you have at least one American parent and you were born abroad, in from what I have heard, most have lived in the US for at least 14 years, so they have passed US citizenship on to their child by birth.
Right. Okay. How about this one? Do I have to be a resident of a state? For example, if I am no longer a resident of the state I left when I moved abroad, do I have to identify myself as a resident somewhere to vote?
You have to register to vote in a state in order to vote. There's no way to um, vote in US elections without registering with a state. So you need to pick a state. It's based on your address of where you last lived, even if you I mean, I've talked to some people who are accidental Americans who have registered to vote and they only lived in one place until they were 1 year old. So that would be the address that you would use in order to register to vote. And then other people I've talked to who, they moved abroad, but it's just easier for them to register to vote with their parent or their siblings' address. So then they register to vote and vote in wherever their family member lives. So it depends on how you want to do it, but you have to register with a state because that is how voter registration works.
Thank you. Um, Another one is, it seems like there's no benefit to selecting return is uncertain. as it may hinder your ability to vote in state and local elections. But would you ever recommend selecting it?
Um, it it is helpful if you want to prove that you are not a state resident, and therefore uh not liable for state tax. So I think, for example, California, or Virginia, given that they're sticky states, um, I mean, if there's a way for you to kind of figure out a way to tick the other box to be able to vote in state elections, but it also kind of depends on the like, are there any state elections that are worth voting in? I mean, a lot of them are, but you need to kind of like look at your personal situation, look at you know, some people, if they're not confident, they'll just tick the return as uncertain because they just don't want to mess with the state tax liability. But other people really want to be able to vote for governor, and like I mentioned, those marginal very few votes are determining the winner in a lot of these races. So again, we're very happy to take questions to help you like kind of think through. Ultimately, it's up to you, and it's your choice of which box you tick based on your personal circumstances. But if you want to drop us an email, again, it's all dependent on the state. So a little bit more information is needed in general on that.
Hmm. Here's a good one. Laura says, in the past, the county elections department in Texas did not send my absentee ballot in time for me to return it by election day. In the future, should I instead request my absentee ballot from vote from abroad?
I mean, it doesn't matter where you register request your absentee ballot from. Yes, we've had reports from counties in Texas and other states that are not as vote from abroad friendly as they should be. We've even had to get involved in certain people who their local election official was saying that they weren't eligible to vote even though they were. And so when you have somebody from Democrats Abroad or from the Vote from Abroad team get on the phone and talk and explain to the local election official who should know these things, but when they explain it, then they're like, oh, okay, that's fine. So what I would do is I would recommend emailing your local election official to make sure that your absentee ballot request form has been received. And you can even call them and say, hi, can you please check that my absentee ballot has been received and that I will receive my ballot in time. And they're all required to send the absentee ballot 45 days before the election day. So you can set a reminder in your calendar in order to look out for if you sign up for email ballots, which I hopefully you should, then make sure that it's arrived. And if it hasn't arrived on time, then you can call them and ask them to email you your ballot.
Thank you. That's a good one. Any update on the fee to renounce American citizenship? It's supposed to be reduced. Have you heard anything about a timeline on that?
No. And if I were to put money on it, I would say they're not going to reduce it until after the election.
Hmm.
There's no requirement for them to, I mean, they've announced that they're going to reduce it, but they haven't said when, and there's no requirement for them to reduce it at any point. Um, they could do it in 3 years if they wanted. I don't think they will do it in 3 years, but my hope is that we will actually be able to start seeing some of the advocacy efforts that we've within Democrats Abroad as well as other organizations have been putting in a lot of time and effort in order to make it easier for people abroad. And I mean, I don't think that RBT will pass by the time that they reduce the fee, but I'm hoping that people will really reconsider given that once you renounce, that's it. There's no going back. But the laws do change, and we're working very hard to change the laws so that people don't have to renounce because of the tax problems.
Thank you. Here's a good one. What is the deadline for registering to vote overseas to receive the email ballot?
So there, it depends on your state. If you go to the votefromabroad.org website, there's like a state drop down and you can look at the deadlines for your state.
Fantastic, thank you. So good. I cannot convince a dear friend in Paris who is an accidental American that the IRS is not connected to the election authorities. Besides having her listen to your talk, are there any official documents or other sources that could reassure her?
Yeah, I mean, the information that I'm gonna share hopefully will be helpful. You can forward her the slides. There's also the FAP website that like I quoted from earlier. So there are a lot of different resources and documents about that.
Let's have a look. I don't remember if I've already registered a ballot to vote in November 2024. Do I just register again? Will that cause any issue if there's a double request?
No, you can do that if you want. You could also equally just call up your local election official and ask them, have you received my ballot? Am I registered to vote? And that'll save you from having to fill out a ballot request form again, or an absentee ballot request again. But no, there's no problems with double requests. If you want to just be sure, then yeah, go ahead. You can submit another one.
Okay. Paula says, I'm a former California resident 43 years ago. I have a bank account in California. If I change the address to Texas, would that clarify my status as a non-resident if I do that now?
Like I said, it really depends on your personal circumstances. So do you have property? Do you have a bank account? What else do you have? I know that some people will go through a lot of steps to terminate their state residency before when they move to really make it 100% clear to California that they are no longer a California state resident and therefore no longer liable for California state tax. So it really depends on what your connections are. And again, you can call the California State, shoot, I forget what they're called, but it's the California State Tax Authority. And you can talk to them to find out like what are the steps you need to take to sever your California state tax resident status.
Here's one. I'm currently registered as a voter in Wisconsin, my last place of residency. My sister lives in Florida. Can I change my voter residency?
Yeah, if you want. I would say that your vote is probably worth a lot more in Wisconsin, though. Um, just from a partisan perspective, we need more Democrats voting in Wisconsin. I'm not saying Florida is a lost cause. I'm not saying that at all. But I would say that your vote will carry more weight in Wisconsin. So I've talked to other people about that, like changing your voter registration address, like with family, like you can also kind of look at and evaluate like where is your vote gonna go further or count more, so you can, yeah, like I said, you can register with your sister if you want to. It's up to you.
Can you register anywhere, or do you have to have some family or address or reason to register somewhere?
Yeah, no, you can't register ever anywhere.
Yeah.
You have to have either lived there or it's based on your last address. So if your address is your sister in Florida, then you can use that address. That's fine. But you need to have, I mean, I've even had people who again, an accidental American who couldn't remember their last known address because they moved when they were one. So they registered to vote with the hospital that they were born at.
Ah,
Yeah, you just
yeah.
need an address that you can say that was my address at
Yeah.
some point.
Okay. Um, somebody says, do you need to file tax every year as an expat, especially if you're exempt from paying in two countries? Or is it possible to file every few years?
So the way it works, as I imagine it works in all other countries, is that if you are above the filing threshold, then you need to file a US tax return. It's roughly $15,000. What I can do is if you email me, I can send you the link on the IRS website that will help you determine whether you need to file a tax return. But it's better to assume, just like we get this question a lot, like, do I have to file a tax return? From a US perspective, even if you don't owe any US tax, there's still a filing requirement, unfortunately. So you it's better to assume that you have a filing requirement and that you should file than to assume that you don't. And there's a link on the IRS website. You can just search for it. It says, "Do I need to file?" And you go through the wizard and it will tell you whether you need to file or not.
Thank you. I think just we have time for one more, and I would say to everyone, there are lots of questions that are quite personal. Reach out to Rebecca, or we'll send an email in a minute if you have further questions. But in the time we have, we can just do one more. So it's a question for accidental Americans who have never lived in the US. Where do they register to vote?
So you would, sorry, very good question. You register to vote based on your parents' last address in the United States.
Okay, simple. So if you've never lived in the US, but you're a US citizen, you register at your parents' last address in the US.
Yep.
Fantastic. Well, look, that's all we have time for. Rebecca, thank you so much once again for the fantastic presentation. Thank you to everyone for joining us today.